last week. And so if I show like your file, don't get all freaked out about it. It's not that I'm like hammering on you. I would say this, about a third of this class ended up doing the project exactly the way I'd asked for it or expected it, is maybe a better way of putting it. Another third of you guys did it in such a way that it satisfied the requirements, but we have issues that we should talk about. And then there was probably about a third of you as well that missed the mark one way or the other. So I just need to make sure that everybody understands what it is we're doing and is on the same page. So like I say, if I show your pictures, I'm not trying to humiliate anybody here. It's just that there was an issue, and that I can show one set of images that show the problem, but you can be assured that out of this class, at least 6 other people made the same mistake or did the same thing. So with that being said, I'm going to show you Parker's first, because this was one that was actually done correctly, and I'll show you what it is that I ultimately look for in this image. So it opens up, and the first thing that I do, you'll notice if you, oh, sorry, you can't see a thing, can you? Come on, use your imagination. Yeah, I'm gonna kill some of this light. Okay, so this is Parker's image, one of them. And I just want to point out a couple things really quickly. So the first thing that I do, if you look at this image, there's a drop-down menu that exists right here on the bottom part of your frame. We'll open up an image in just a second, guys, and you can actually go through this. But it's a way to actually show you different things about this image. So you can set it up to show you your size, and in this case you can see it's 137.3 megabytes. Seems a little large to me for a single image from a 35mm camera, but then I can go down to the document profile. It shows me that this is in Adobe RGB, but you'll also notice right here it says that this is in 16 bits per channel. We need to talk about bit depth in this class. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but I had said to you guys before that what we're really looking for here, the amount of information we need to describe an image for the work that we do in this class, as long as you're in Adobe RGB, you should be doing it in 8-bit. Going to 16-bit doubles the amount of information that you're using to describe your image. And it's really unnecessary in Adobe RGB. However, if you're using smart objects, it's completely unnecessary because you've got all the raw data in your smart object if you've done the smart object part correctly. And then finally, there are a bunch of people in this class who brought stuff it came into Photoshop as ProPhoto RGB. ProPhoto RGB is a much larger color space, and in that case, you do need 16 bits of information. You need a larger information set to describe that space. So in this case, it's overkill, but there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's just that it makes this file twice as big as it needs to be. Also, when you're processing it, no matter what you're doing to it, if you run filters on it or you're doing other things, it takes twice as long to do it because the file is twice as big. At any rate, another place that you can pick up that 16-bit is this little 16 right here. That's where you can actually see it. So that's the first thing that I'd look for. So again, I'm fine with this file the way it is right now. It's a little overkill, but I'm fine with it. However, the next thing I do is come over to his smart object. You can tell that this is a smart object. If I double click on his smart object, it takes me into Camera Raw. So this is a smart object that is based on raw data, which is exactly what I wanted. This is what I want to get from you guys. So that was an example of how it was supposed to be. Yes. Yes, which is what I'm going to show you right now. I know. So we'll take a look at yours right now since you volunteered. Yeah, I know, right? Shoot. I'll show you. Okay, so this is the next problem. So that if you take a look at my screen right here, what do you see as the problem? That the profile that's embedded in this is sRGB. And so I've got two problems with this. Number one is that sRGB now is a much smaller color space. Have we looked at color spaces yet in this class? They actually physically looked at them? Okay, I'm going to jump out of this really quickly. We're going to take a quick detour, guys, and I'm going to try to make this detour as fast as I possibly can.
Bridget and I had this issue when we were editing too, where that thing popped up.
Okay. Okay. So color spaces. We talk about color spaces. We keep talking about that in this class, but we need to really define what a color space is and give you guys some grounding for it. So when you think about color, you know so far that in Adobe Photoshop, what we've been basically talking about is RGB, right? Red, green, and blue. So I need everybody to fire up Photoshop for me really quickly. And tell me when it's open. All right, so has everybody got it open? Okay, I need you to come over. If you look at the bottom of the tool palette over here, this is where you have your foreground and background color. It doesn't really matter what these are right now. So again, if you needed to default it back to black and white, you would simply hit the D key. But no matter what the color is there, if you click on the foreground color, it opens up what we call the color picker. So in the color picker, we have got 4 sets of variables, 4 sets of things to describe color. We've got this top group right here, which is hue, saturation, and brightness. We've got the next group down here, which is red, green, and blue. Over here, we've got the LAB space. L stands for the luminosity of a channel. A is an axis that runs from green to magenta, and B is an axis that runs from blue to yellow. These all are systems to describe complete color. And then you have CMYK down here at the bottom. So if you click on the red radio button, the button that's right next to R, and you type in 255 in that little box right there, you will get, and then make sure that you've got 0 green and 0 blue. To actually go to jump down to the next entry dialog box for the green, you can use your tab key. So if you were in the red box, you can just hit tab, put in 0 for green, and tab again, 0 for blue. That is the definition of a pure red. As red can get. So what you'll see in this, if you click on your the radio button next to the R right here, that this column then becomes the red slider. This now becomes what this radio button represents. You'll see that you've got 2 double-headed arrows that are sitting up at the very top. You still fucking can't see that. Hang on, let me get rid of some more of this light. Sorry, I just feel like it's washing up that screen completely. Better? Worse? Thank you. Okay, so if you grab the little double-headed arrow thing up at the top, you can drag it down to the bottom, and you can watch that it will actually change values that are here in this R channel that are in the represent the R value. And you can drag it all the way down here to the bottom. And once you get down to the bottom, it is now zeroed out. However, you would say, looking at that, well, that's black. Well, the truth of it is, in Photoshop world, that is a black red. It is still a red color, but it has no brightness, it has no saturation. It still does have a hue, which is red, but again, because it's zeroed out, we are at black. If you click this and drag it back up again, you'll notice as we get up into the mid region here, what a middle red would actually be is 128. This is also still a pure red. It's just got 50% brightness. You can see that when you change one of these sliders, it changes everything else in here. So we'll talk about what hue, saturation, and brightness is in just a second. If you go all the way up to the top again to 255, that's as pure, saturated, bright red as you can possibly get. So reds work on a scale of 0 to 255. If you drag it all the way down again to zero it out, click on the green now and type in 255 for green, and click on the radio button next to the G, you will see that you get the exact same thing in greens for our green values. We started a green value at its max at 255. We actually have a value of black green, which is 0. What this does is what it's representing is that you have 256 tones of green, because 0 is a tone of green. You have 256 reds as well. It goes from 0 red to 255 red. And then finally, if you click on the blue radio button and type in 255, you get blue as well. If we click on, I'm going to go up to the red again and type in 255. Hit the tab key and go to 255 for the green so that they all now are 255. You'll see that the new resulting color of that is white, because what we have done is we've taken our red, green, and blue at their maximum intensity. That's what gives us white. You'll also notice if we, again, click on the top one and put in a 0, hit the tab key, 0, tab key, 0. Again, this is a neutral gray. All three values are at 0. That represents black. If you type into the red channel again and type in a 128, tab key 128, tab key 128, that is the definition of a middle gray. So again, in RGB world, equal values of RGB, no matter what they are, will equal a neutral gray, and then just depending on where they are on that scale of 0 to 255 gives you their level of brightness. Are there questions about this? Are we good on this? Understanding all of color theory. That's what this is all about.
What you're saying makes sense. Just application.
Yeah, application. So we're heading right there right now. Okay, so I am going to cancel out of this. I'm going to go back to the color lecture part really quickly. So this is why this matters. Color is dimensional. It can be plotted in 3 dimensions, just like a room can be plotted in 3 dimensions. The problem that you run into most color systems is that they are 2-dimensional representations of it. You cannot get all 3 of these colors in 2 dimensions. You need all 3 dimensions to get this color. So I need everybody to imagine this room as a square. Don't imagine this room as being odd shaped, but imagine it being a cube. So it's a square. So I'm going to start over here in this lower corner over here. I need everybody to look at this. So in this bottom corner right here, in my cube room, in my color space, this bottom corner right here by definition is 0, 0, 0. What is that? Black. So if you look, and the way this color thing is actually laid out, if I go from, so imagine this is a solid corner. If I go from the solid corner down here, which is 0, 0, black, straight up to the corner right there. I don't go out into the room here at all, and I don't go out in the room there at all. All the way up here at the top is pure green, 255. I still have no red, and I've still got no blue. So this line that runs up and down is that slider that you just did of green. It starts at black, and it goes up to pure green at the top. Does that make sense? So if you look in the very back of that illustration, at the very top corner in the back is pure green. I'm going to bring my line back down here to the bottom. I'm going to start at 0, 0, 0, and now instead I'm going to actually do the line that goes all the way out here. It comes out here. So the line that comes out here and hits the final wall out here is my pure red. I'm not going up in height at all, so I have no green, and I'm not coming out in the room at all, so I have no blue. So this spot right out here on the very corner is going to be pure blue. Does that make sense? Good. And then, no, I'm sorry, pure red. Pure red. I've got my things wrong there. Pure red. So then finally, I'm going to go all the way back here to the corner again, and then I'm going to do the line all the way out here. So I'm starting black, 0, 0, 0, all the way out here to the edge of the room out here. Down here on the floor at the bottom, I end up with a pure blue. I have no green because I'm not up in the ceiling at all, and I've got no red because I'm not out in this space at all. Does that make sense? Max? So if I go all the way out here, all the way up to the ceiling, and all the way out to that corner, what do I end up? What's the corner out here?
White.
Why? Because it's 255, 255, 255, right?
Sure.
What is this spot right here in the very middle of the room?
Middle gray.
Exactly, 128. I'm halfway up, I'm halfway out, and I'm halfway in this direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Middle gray. So color is a space. Color is described as a three-dimensional space. And that's what we've got going here. That's what this guy is. So it's three-dimensional. There's a unique point for every single color in here. It does describe RGB. It does describe CMY. However, it does not have to be these primaries, which becomes important to us. We'll talk about it in what it is just a second. HSB, hue, saturation, and brightness. How many people in this room have ever heard of that in Photoshop? How many have not? Okay, fine. So we're going to talk about hue, saturation, and brightness, but it is not, they are not primaries. Primaries are red, green, and yellow. I mean, listen to me, red, green, and blue. But also CMYK are also, CMY are also primaries in a subtractive system as well. So, but HSB are not. And again, you'll see what that means in just a second. The reason this matters to us is that you can now define color by location. This becomes critical to us. So how many people in this room struggled with getting the image on their screen to be what they printed out? Everybody struggles with that, right? The reason you're having that struggle is that what you're looking at on your screen is in one color space, and what happens in your printing is another color space. So the trick to this is trying to map what's happening on your screen to the printer, and they do it by location. Because again, what other choice do you have? Are you just going to say to the printer, oh, I want a kind of a cyany yellow? What the fuck does that mean? Right? An orangey red, that's the color I'm going for. Well, that means nothing, right? But if you say, I want a red of 51, a green of 153, and a blue of 204, isn't everybody, let's put that in. Go back to Photoshop. Click on your foreground color. Click on the red value right here. It was a red of 51. Was that what it is? I'll go back. I'll just give you guys the colors to put in. So it's a red of 51. Hit the tab key, a green of 153. Hit the tab key, a blue of 204. So I'm going to go back in Photoshop and see what mine looks like. 153 and 204. That is a location in space. Three-dimensional location in space. That color is identical on everybody's computer in here. Make sense? All right. I'm going to cancel out of that really quick. I'm going to take you guys on a magic journey ride. You know there's a song like that, right? Okay. I need everybody to go to... actually, hang on one second. I'm going to jump ahead really quickly, and then we'll go to. So, who in this room can tell me what hue is? Come on, you're all art students. It's color. It's the color. Anybody else? This is what hue actually is. So hue is the property of pure color that distinguishes it from other pure colors. Now, I know that that may sound like we're nitpicking here, but this is important to understand this principle. It is the property that gives it what we call, and then the color name. So when we say something is red, what is the difference between red and blue, or the red and green, or red and, or yellow and blue, whatever? That is what we are talking about using those labels is hue. So if you look at these 7 color patches right here, the brightness of these are all the same. The saturation of these are all the same. The only thing that is different in these is the hue. Make sense? What's saturation? Shoot. That's an excellent way of putting it. So if I've got a purely saturated color at one extreme, what do I have at the other extreme? Close. Say what?
I said a weak one.
No. How many people in here have ever desaturated an image? What happened to it? It becomes gray. Saturation deals with the purity of the color. The opposite of a completely purely saturated color is gray. You have added the complement to it to the point that it is no longer, it still is a color, but it has no saturation in it at all. Make sense? Okay, and then so in this case, this is exactly the same hue. It's exactly the same brightness. The only thing that is changing in these 7 steps is the saturation of the sky. So finally, what is brightness? This is the toughest one for everybody. Brightness is the property by which the color appears to contain more or less light. Does that make sense? This becomes really critical to us. In one extreme, you've got black. The other extreme, you'll actually have white. In between, you've got shades of different colors. So this is a color wheel. How many people actually painted one of these when you were in the 7th grade? Yeah, we all did it, right? However, color wheels, that's probably you were working with a pigment color wheel. This is going to be a light color wheel. So the design of this is important because this is how it's been standardized out. What they did was to build a color wheel, they take the 3 primaries, they take red, green, and blue, and they make them as far away from one another as they can possibly be. How many degrees are there in a circle? 360. If you've got 3 values that you need to be as far from each other as you can possibly get them on a circle, what degrees are they at? 120 and 240, right? Or minus 120. So to get this green as far away as I can get from the red and still also be able to get as far away from this blue, this ends up being at 120 degrees. This ends up being at 240 degrees. Does that make sense? And then as we come back here to 0, 0 is also 360. Are we good on this part? Then in between these two is where you have your secondary colors in an RGB world. So secondary colors, when you mix red and green together, you get yellow. When you mix green and blue together, you get cyan. And when you mix blue and red together, you get magenta. The secondary colors are the complementary colors of the primaries. So the opposite of red is what? Cyan. The opposite of green is what? And the opposite of yellow is what? And the opposite of blue is what? Exactly. What happens in the very center? Why? Because I have lost my saturation. The way you drop saturation is by adding a complementary color. If I've got a pure yellow and I start to add blue to it, it starts moving in this direction. Right at this point right here, I've got exactly equal amounts of blue and yellow, and that's why I end up here at a pure gray in the middle. Same thing happens on the red cyan axis and the green and magenta axis. Does that make sense? But what's missing from this equation? I've got hue. Hue is on the outside of this circle. Where are my most saturated colors on this circle? On the very outside edge, right? Where's my least saturated versions? In the very center, right? So I have 2 values in here, right? I've got hue and I have saturation. What am I missing? Brightness. This is why we have to have 3 dimensions to describe color, regardless of the system. Whether it's an RGB system, a CMY system, or an HSB system, which is what this is. So to fix this problem, what they end up doing is they take the color wheel and they flip it so that the wheel becomes like the equator of the Earth, and then they add brightness as the 3rd axis in space. So if you imagine this being a globe, and this is the equator right here, and the very edge of this is our most saturated color. In the very center right here is our least saturated color, just like we just took the color wheel and flipped it. You guys good with that? Then brightness goes, if you imagine, again, this is the center of the Earth. Brightness actually goes from the center of the Earth up to the North Pole. Things get brighter. Down to the South Pole, they get darker. Why is this thing not a cylinder? Why is it 2 cones? Ultimately, but what does that mean to move? What's actually happening when that happens? You're losing saturation. Again, saturation is the exterior out here. As I start to get brighter and brighter and brighter, I am going to white. White is pure gray. White has got no saturation in it at all. Same thing happens as I go down to black. As I get darker and darker and darker, my saturation decreases. Does that make sense? All right, really quickly, back into Photoshop again. Click on the radio button. When you do not remember what saturation, hue, and brightness are, come in here to the color picker. If you click on the H radio button and you put in, I'm going to ask you right now just to put in for the value for saturation, put in 100. And then for the brightness, also put in 100. It's easier to see. Then in saturation again, in hue, 0 degrees. Remember, if we looked at the color wheel, I said 0 degrees by definition was red at 3 o'clock, right? So what's the opposite of, if I go halfway around a circle from 0, what do I get? Degrees. 180. What would be the opposite of red before you type that in? What's the complement of red? Cyan. Put in 180. What color do you have? Exactly. Put in 120. What color do you have? Green, because it wasn't green. Exactly 120 degrees away from red. Put in 240. This shit makes sense, right? So that gives us a pure blue. If you click on the saturation slider, you will notice that this column, again, this column always reflects whatever radio button you plug into this. So I've got a pure blue. I'm going to grab my saturation slider and I'm going to drag it all the way down, and it starts to actually lose its saturation. And at the end, I end up with white. Why don't I end up with a middle gray? White is a gray, but it's not a middle gray. The reason I don't is because my brightness is at 100%. So if you click on your brightness and drag it down now halfway, you've got middle gray. So this is HSB. You will also notice that all your RGB values have been changing right along with it. These two are, HSB is based on RGB. Does this make sense to you guys? Okay, so now I need to take you on a little ride. I need everybody to go to their Finder. You need to go to your application folder. Inside the application folder, if you scroll down sort of towards the bottom, there's a utilities folder. I need you to click on that utilities folder. Inside of that utilities folder is a utility called Color Sync Utility. I need you to double click on that guy. It'll open up Color Sync Utility, and before you do anything, your screen may not look like mine. There's a series of icons that sit up at the top up here. You need to make sure you've clicked on the profile one. Then your screen is going to look different, Max. Yeah. Click on again, you're on the profile first aid. Click on the next icon over. Are you okay now? Okay. So again, the next icon over that says profiles. Yours is going to look a little bit different than mine, but you should at least at the very top have the same thing I've got here that says System. I want you to click and do the little drop-down menu. And in that drop-down menu, you should see Adobe RGB. If you click on Adobe RGB, you get a three-dimensional generated representation of Adobe RGB. If you click on this, you can move it. If you go home and get really stoned and put on Pink Floyd, you can spend hours doing this. This is an Adobe RGB space. It is a physical space. If you orient it so it looks like mine is right here, this is very similar to the way it was in the double cone. I've got white at the top, I've got black at the bottom. Running through the center of this space are where all of my grays are, but on the edges that exist here on the outside, this is where my most saturated colors are. Does that make sense what's going on here? So it's a true space. Does that make sense to you guys? You get that part, right? Okay. I need everybody to see, look at my screen really quick. See this little arrow that's at this part right up here? If you click on that little drop-down arrow and you come down to hold for comparison, it will gray this guy out. It will still give it to you so you can still see it, but it ghosts it out. And this is going to allow us to compare the size of color spaces. Does that make sense? Who have I lost? Is everybody with me? you're going to see right now. This is a space. It is a three-dimensional space, like a room. It's shaped odd, but it's a space, right? And all the colors that are available to you in Adobe RGB are inside this, okay? But I want to compare this to sRGB. So you who are using sRGB, check this out. With this hold for comparison, you should also have an sRGB space in here. And if you click on that, you will then see sRGB space that has been put inside Adobe RGB space. Look at all of the color that you just gave up. All of this is color that exists in Adobe RGB but is not in sRGB. It is a ton of green, it is a ton of cyan, but it's all the way around. It's the blues, it's the red, it's the whole thing. That sRGB sits inside of this space. So, for Adobe RGB. So for people who bring their files into Photoshop as sRGB, you can't go the other way. You can actually start in a bigger space and make it littler, but you can never go back. You can never make it bigger. So you have just fucked your file. So what's the right one then? Adobe RGB. We've been talking about this since the first day of this class. So I got one other thing to show you. One other thing to show you, because some of you guys are doing this. So I'm going to come in that same little drop-down part, and I'm going to say clear comparison. I'm going to get rid of that so I don't see that comparison. You guys may not be able to find this. I'm going to show you where mine is. So if you can't find this, just look up at my screen so you can actually see this. I'm going to scroll down to find ProPhoto RGB. If you want to find it, you might be able to find it. Go all the way to the bottom of your list. There's an arrow that you can drop down called Other. It's where other profiles are stored. Then there will be another one inside of that, a folder inside that called /library/application support/Adobe. Inside of that, you can actually find ProPhoto RGB. It's right here. So I'm going to click on ProPhoto RGB, and you see it ends up being a gigantic space. And then I'm going to click again on Hold for Comparison. So the little drop-down menu guy right here, Hold for Comparison. And then I'm going to scroll all the way up again to the top and pick Adobe RGB. Look at the difference. So this is what I was telling you guys. 8 bits of information is enough to describe Adobe RGB color space because it's relatively small compared to ProPhoto. ProPhoto RGB space is so gigantic. You need more information, more data to describe that space, and it has to be 16-bit. Does that make sense what's going on here? There's some disadvantages to using ProPhoto. One of the disadvantages of using ProPhoto space is that the space is so big, it actually has color in it that you cannot see with your eyes. Human eyes can't see it. It's larger than the space of human eyes. That's a liability. The other biggest liability is that the best retouching monitors that are made today show you Adobe RGB. So if you are working in ProPhoto RGB, which a lot of you guys were, your monitor is showing you this little chunk in the middle. All your big beautiful color that's out here is just being pitched. Does that sound like a problem? Yeah, huge problem, right? You can't see it. Are we good about this? Okay. No, it's not in your camera. Your camera's color space is fixed by the sensor. But when you bring your files into Photoshop, that's when this part actually matters. So that's the whole process. So we are going to do it again. So do you guys all have your Lightroom catalog with you today? I need you to fire up your Lightroom catalog. All right, does everybody have it open, or do I need to wait a little bit? Are you guys good? Okay, let me know. All right, has everybody got Lightroom open? You need to make sure you're working with a RAW file. So in my case, I've got an ARW. It's a Sony RAW file. In your case, it has to either be that or a CR2, which is a Canon RAW file, or an NEF, which is a Nikon RAW file. If you have JPEGs or TIFFs or Photoshop files in your Lightroom catalog, I don't want you working with them. This is all about working with raw data. So I don't care what it looks like, just everybody needs to find a raw file. Has everybody got one? So again, not a JPEG, not a TIFF, not a Photoshop file, a raw file, either a CR2, an NEF, or an ARW. Are we good on that? Everybody got one? Okay. Before we make the move to Photoshop, you need to come up to Lightroom, down to Preferences. Inside of Preferences, there's a series of tabs that run along the top. You want to click on the third tab over from the left that says External Editing. In that, you will have a drop-down menu here. This is your first external editor right here. You can leave it as TIFF or PSD. It doesn't matter which one of these you're going to do, because this is going to be for in Adobe Photoshop. So it makes absolutely no difference which one of these you do. However, in the drop-down menu for color space, you have options. You've got ProPhoto RGB, Adobe RGB, Display P3, and sRGB. So some of you have got this set at sRGB, and that's why when you bring your images into Photoshop, they are in that small space that is worthless to you. Some of you have also got it set to ProPhoto RGB, which is a space that's so large you cannot see the color on a monitor. Or you've got Adobe RGB. It's the one that's in the middle, and it's the one that I suggest you guys work with until and unless they make a much, much, much better monitor and you spend the $150,000 it's going to cost to pay for that thing. Yeah.
Should we also change it?
We're almost there. So the bit depth, if you click on that, you will see that you either have 8 bits or 16 bits. Again, what is bit depth? You will hopefully hear this on the video, but I need everybody to look at this because it matters that you know what this is we're talking about. So watch your eyes because I'm turning on another light. All right, can you guys see this board at all?
Yes.
No? Okay. Who in this room, does anybody in this room know what bit depth is? Shoot.
So it's how many different colors. Well, so I know that like you do like with 8-bit, it makes X amount of colors. Like I think it's 128. When you're 16-bit, you can do 255 or something. Am I close?
That was no, you're not.
Because I know 2-bit color is just like black and white, right? Or not 1-bit.
I'll show you. Anybody else want to take a shot at this? No. Yes, it does, but not really. So hold on one second. I'm going to show you what it is. Where are you? Okay, don't get scared. Binary system. All computers work in binary code. Everything that's, all your digital files are binary system. All binary means is that there's two options. So if you think of this, this is a light switch. The light switch can either be two things. It can be on or off. That's it. Does that make sense? So in this case, I've got strictly two possible outcomes that can happen. I'm going to add a switch to this. I've now got two switches. I've just doubled the possible combinations that now exist. They can both be off, they can both be on, or the left one can be off, the right one on, the left one on, the right one off. Does that make sense? I'm going to add another switch to this. 8 possibilities. And you see what happens is every single time I add one of these switches, I double my options. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is switches. Transistors. How many people in this room know that a transistor is a switch? All the transistors that exist in your computer, there's billions of them on your processor part, they're switches. However, instead of the light being on and off, they represent 0 and 1. In the case of 0, in this switch, electricity runs through the switch, again, just like it does with a light. If there's no electricity coming, the light would be off. In this case, if there's no electricity coming, they assign it a value of 0. If there is electricity coming through the switch, they give it a value of 1. Those are the only two possibilities, 0 and 1. That's it, no others. Does that make sense? If you add another switch, you have 4 possibilities. They're both zeros, they're both ones, or the left one is 1. This is making sense here, right? We good on this part? Same thing. Somebody got really smart a long time ago and said, well, you know, we can assign tonal values to those. So what they did was they said, if the switch says 0, we're going to make that black. And if it says 1, we're going to make that white. That's if you only had 2 cases. However, if you add another switch, they said, okay, well, we can be really clever. We can make 0, 0 black. We can make 1, 1 white. But we can make 0, 1 this darker gray, 1, 0 this lighter gray. Does that sort of make sense? So this is how computers work. So again, this is how your images work. So the way you calculate bit depth is it's always these 2's. How many times do you multiply 2 times 2? In an 8-bit image, you do it 8 times. So if you look at this here, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 2's. And if you do 2 times 2, you guys are all mathematicians. You can all count this out with me. What is 2 times 2?
4.
Exactly, times 2. Times 2, times 2, times 2, times 2, times 2, 256. How many colors in Photoshop tones and our tonal scales do we work with?
256.
Yes, because it's an 8-bit image.
And 128 is a neutral gray.
Bingo. We good on this?
We're great now. All right.
Okay. So that would be for grayscale. If you do this in RGB, you have 256 reds, 256 greens, 256 blues, and if you multiply all that shit together, you get 16,777,216 colors. It's a lot of color.
So 8-bit is fine.
This is what you get in Photoshop, and this is basically the bit depth. So in 8-bit, a bit depth of 8, you have 256 in grayscale. You have 256 grays. However, you've got that 16,777,000 colors, right? That 16,777,000 colors is enough to describe Adobe RGB. But it is not enough to describe ProPhoto RGB. What happens in ProPhoto RGB is it's so big, these colors, if you only give it 16 million colors, they're too far away from one another. So instead of giving you the illusion of continuous tone, you see these giant steps between your color. How many people in this room have ever had banding or posterization in one of their images? It's usually you'll see it in skies where it'll see instead of having a pure blue sky, you will actually get an area. It looks like a sort of like a river area of one color right next to another one. That is posterization. The reason that's happening is that there isn't enough in between colors to describe that transition. So you get this jump, you get a stair step. So instead of having a ramp that goes down perfectly smooth, you end up with this jagged stair step thing, and the space between those colors becomes incredibly obvious. That ProPhoto is so big, that's already happening if you are in 8-bit. However, if you go to 16-bit, can somebody, I don't, yeah, so here, let me come across here. Yes. Can anybody tell me what this number is? This is, I think, all right, so this is hundreds, thousands, millions, billion, trillions. Okay, 281 trillion, 474 million, 976, oh, I'm sorry, 474 billion, 976 million, 710,656 colors. That's a lot of fucking color. That's what you need to describe ProPhoto being in the size it is, the biggest, that big space. Does that make sense? Are there questions about this?
So the sky banding, that does happen with 8-bit?
It can happen with 8-bit.
So in order to fix that, would you then switch to Pro?
The thing is that you can't change this. You can, if you start out in 16-bit, you're fine. But if you're in 8-bit and you go to 16, you've still only got 8-bit. You've still only got the 16 million colors. You've just spread them out in a much bigger space.
So you could go back into your, like
yes,
where we're in now
yes.
and change it.
Yes, but again, none of this is really going to matter because when we bring it into as a smart object, we can change that in Photoshop whenever we want. Yes? It does. Most sensors, like a typical sensor in an Nikon and a camera right now, is 14-bit. So if we go back to this same one right here, you'll see that in 14-bit, it's around 4 billion, I don't know, 4 trillion. It's this number right here. Photoshop can actually do 32-bit. Look at the number of colors that exist down here.
Is there any living thing that can actually see all that?
Oh, no, no. No, what this is, it just ends up being much, much, much finer gradations between. So if I've got two colors that are right next to each other, in a mathematical world anyway, you can actually subdivide the distance between these two, even though you see them touching right now. You could subdivide it so there was 1 billion colors in between the two.
Right, it's just a further decimal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
But if your camera sensor, most camera sensors cap out at 14
Yes.
or 16 or 24, whatever.
No, nobody goes up to 24. Nobody that I know of.
Okay, so then why would you ever need 30? Why would Photoshop need to use 32-bit?
Hold that question for a much later discussion. There are reasons to do it. The biggest reason is that you can actually take multiple images HDR-wise and combine them together, so you can take a very, very, very large dynamic range that you get by bracketing your exposure and compress those all into a single image, and then you need 32-bit to describe that range. Yeah, I know, right? Okay, so back into Lightroom really quickly, guys, because we've got a lot more to get to tonight. Back in Lightroom really quickly, we are going to change this to either TIFF or our PSD, which stands for Photoshop file. Our color space is going to be Adobe RGB. 8-bit is going to be our bit depth in this. You do not need to worry about resolution. This has nothing to do with your image. This will just change the scaling in Photoshop. It doesn't have any impact on your image at all, and you would do no compression at all. You could add another external editor to yours. So for some of you people who want to edit in other programs, if you have something else, you could set it up here, but for our purposes, we're just going to leave this as it is right now. And then close this guy up, and we should be ready to go. Then take your raw file to get your raw file into Photoshop the correct way. You come up to the Photo menu, down to Edit In, and you do not pick Edit in Adobe Photoshop CC. This was another mistake a bunch of you guys made, and I'll show you the difference in just a second. Instead, you want to come down to here to Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. When that happens, it's going to send that raw file to Photoshop. If you then go to Photoshop, it should be sitting in there as a smart object with this little icon down in the bottom. If you double click on this guy, it will bring you into Camera Raw, because this is the raw file right here. You can see it's named right here underneath it. This is this raw file. This is a copy of your raw data. This is the critical part about doing smart objects in this fashion. This is a smart object that is based on raw data. If you click on the link, the hyperlink that is at the very bottom of your screen right here, it will open up. This is where you tell Camera Raw what you want to how you want to bring this raw data into Photoshop. You because you're not in there yet. Double click on this guy. Now you're in Camera Raw, and that's the hyperlink right there. So, guys, click on the hyperlink. You could change this now, even though you brought this image into Photoshop in Adobe RGB 8-bit. If you click on this drop-down menu, you can change that to Pro Photo and to 16-bit if there is some reason that you need it. So all of a sudden, your sky is posterizing. You actually simply change your bit depth here. You don't need to go back into Lightroom because this is a copy of your raw data. This is actually the data your camera wrote. So it's raw. It doesn't have a defined bit depth or color space. Does this make sense? So you could change it here, but in our case, I'm going to leave it as Adobe RGB in 8-bit. And then again, always have this little check box down here to open in Photoshop as a smart object. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that, and then say OK. You will notice as this thing comes in, up at the top, it will actually be listed as Adobe Photoshop RGB. Again, if you click on this drop-down menu and say you want to see your document profile, and you'll also see that it's got 8 bits per channel sitting right here next to it. So that's what this is. This is now the correct way to do that. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, I'm going to show you the incorrect way to do it now, and this is what I think some of you guys ended up doing. I'm not going to save that. I'm going to go back into Lightroom. I need you to do this with me again. So close up the one that we just did. Grab the very same raw file, this very same raw file right here. And I want you to come up to Photo, down to Edit In, and this time go ahead and say Edit in Photoshop. Don't go down to Smart Object. This is the wrong way, but I'm just trying to get you guys to understand why this is wrong. So Edit in Photoshop. It'll take the file again to Photoshop. In Photoshop, if you go into Photoshop, you will notice that there is no little icon down at the bottom. If you double click on this thing, all you get is the ability to rename the layer. You don't get it. You don't go into Camera Raw. This is not a copy of your raw data. This is a baked file. Does everybody get that? So what some of you then did, because you didn't have a smart object, is that you went up here to the layer menu and you came down to smart objects and you said convert this to a smart object. Now you do have that little icon down there, but all you have done is taken that baked file and put it into a protective enclosure. If you double click on this, it will open it up and it'll be sitting right here. This is now the file outside of that protective enclosure, but it is not your raw data. I'm not in Camera Raw. I can't reprocess this. I can't change the bit depth of this guy. I'm fucked. Yes, Carolyn. If it was a raw file, it will. If it's not a raw file, if you were bringing in a JPEG, is it working for you now? So wait, do you have your catalog right now there? And so, okay, so get a raw file. So hang on, go to your grid view really quick. And which is the one that you're actually doing? Okay, that's fine, that's fine. So just pick one of these. It doesn't matter which one you pick. Okay, fine. So then come up to Photo, Edit In, open the Smart Object. Okay, let's see. Then go into Photoshop and see if it's there. So now double click on the icon, not the name, but the icon. And you're in Camera Raw. Okay, that's okay. So guys, one of the problems that this may be what was happening to her, is that it depends on where you click on this. So if you do it correctly, you're always clicking on the icon. You're not clicking on the name. But does this make sense, the difference in this?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, the raw data is critical to have. Okay, we can get rid of this part. We don't need to save that. Are there any other questions about this part? Are we good on this? Okay. I want to talk about topology in this class. How many people in this room have any idea what topology is? How many don't? Okay, so we're going to look at a quick little slideshow of it. This actually, if you go to, you can either watch my screen or you can watch it yourself. If you go to our website, go to session 4, go to the resources for session 4. So again, it would be under modules, session 4, the session 4 resources. Click on that. It'll take you, you'll see down here it says slideshow that's called topology. If you simply click on topology, it will show you examples of topologies. If you want to make your screen big, you can simply click on this little thing to go into full screen. So it'll bring it up and you can actually look at, these are people who were, you can read all about this. There's actually a paper I'm asking you guys to read that speaks about a number of the artists that I'm going to show you right here. But I just want to get through this and talk about the, and not so much the history of the people as much as the pictures that they make. So if you take a look at it, this is a group of, it's a husband and wife team that were doing pictures in Germany in the late 60s, early 70s. And this is an example of a topology. And so when you look at this, it's an image that's actually a series of images that are done that are meant to share a great deal of similarities between each group of between each image. So you can see here that by and large the subject matter is very similar. They're not identical. That's not the idea here, but they're very similar. So they're all cylindrical. They all have some sort of steel skeleton that's involved in them. They are all done in black and white. They are all shot from the same perspective. They are all scaled almost to be exactly the same size. They're very close. Again, they're not identical. But you can sort of see the issue that we're dealing with here in topologies, right? But the thing that makes this critical and makes it a true topology is that these things now have been grouped together to build essentially a single photograph of a group of photographs. Does that make sense? So this is one image. Does that make sense, what we've got going here? Are there questions about that? Okay, so if you continue to click through the slideshow, you will see other examples. Again, this is more examples of their same work. Again, the same work. You sort of get the sense of what's going on here, right? Okay, they're not the only people who do this. If you zip through here, this is the guy who's actually credited with starting topologies in the beginning. He was a photographer who wanted to catalog plants. And so he just shot all of these plants and he put them into a catalog and divided them like this. This is actually a page from the original catalog. And you can see that again, this is another sort of typology. The page now becomes a single image. That's what's going on here. And you can see other examples of his work here. This is actually a scan from the catalog, the original catalog. This guy ended up having a huge influence on artists, not just photographers, but painters as well. And this is actually an example of that. Not the only person doing it. This is another person who's actually doing, another artist is doing the same sort of thing. Again, you can see subject matter, scale, cropping, perspective, lighting, there's this huge amount of consistency in this imagery. And so you can sort of see what's actually happening here. In this case, she's actually framed these in separate frames. However, this would be considered a single image. Does this make sense? You would not go in here and say, yep, I want to buy the little girl in the yellow dress. I'm going to take that home, and then they leave this up. That would not happen. Order in this matters. Sequencing in this matters. Does this all? You guys were talking about those issues earlier tonight, which was great, right? So at any rate, are we sort of getting the idea of what we're talking about here? Okay, so the assignment for next week, I'm going to zoom through all of this. This is the last guy that we'll actually look at right here. There's a couple of things. So to get out of this, if you've gone to full screen, hit your escape key. It'll drop you back out. This is an incredibly important read right here is, can the photographic typology be defined? If you click on that, it's not that long, But what this guy does that I think is really sort of interesting is he defines typology. He ranks typologies. So you read through the introduction part of it, but I'll show you the quick part of what he actually does in this. He takes these 6 elements right here and he gives them a numeric value to rate how strong or how effective a typology actually is. So you'll see he explains what relationship is, comparison, context, process, blah, 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 blah. He takes these elements right here and he uses those to actually rank something. So you'll see right here, he's got subject, environment, process, and presentation, and he ranks them on a scale of 0 to 5, and then he gives that a score. So when he's looking at this set of typologies right here, he's ranking them as a successful 15 out of 20. If you go down here, this is another set of typologies that exist right here. They get a ranking of 19 out of 20. Another set that's right here. So it's an interesting read. It'll give you an interesting take on typologies. So I want you to get through this part. If you then go back, so that's this one right here. There's another thing in here on masks and channels, which we are going to look at in Photoshop in just one second. We probably will not get to this select and mask practice file today. There is a couple of videos about select and mask. You could actually look at these videos for your assignment, and then we will actually do the practice file next week. If we can get to it this week, we will, but I don't think we're going to be able to. But finally, I want you to actually look at our week. So back out to the modules for session 4. So what you're going to see in here is the first assignment is I need you to do a self-evaluation of the project you just turned in. Oh, speaking of the project you just turned in, I'm going to jump out of here really quick. To submit the assignment, I don't want prints. I just want the Photoshop files that you used to make them, and you will turn those in exactly the same way you turned in last week's Photoshop files. So again, if you go to our server, to get to our server, up to the Go menu, down to, for you guys who are on laptops, connect to server, type in that address. For you guys who are on the computers here, you simply go to the little square cube, white cube at the bottom of your dock, the thing that's got the little blue apple on it, click that, go to Class Projects. Inside of Class Projects, go to the Engelhard folder. Inside the Engelhard folder, there's a Dropbox, and you are to just throw it in the Dropbox right here, and I will get it. Again, you don't have to rename the files if you want to just rename the folder that you put them in, but you need to name something. So it's either the folder or the files with your last name underscore first name underscore 3.1. That was the name of that was the number of the assignment. So if you look at this right here, these two guys have actually already put these in, and that's exactly what I want you to do. So that's how you submit the homework that is due tonight. So for next week, back in looking at this, the first assignment for next week is a brief self-evaluation of how you felt this assignment went. So if you click on this, it'll give you a description. I'll show you what it looks like really quickly. It'll tell you what I'm expecting you to do. So you can do this online. I want you to do it online. It tells you how to do online text here. But what were your successes? How'd you feel? Did you answer the assignment? What were your challenges? Blah, 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 blah. Again, I just need some self-reflection on that part. The next one down is Typology Part 1. So if you click on this and open this up in Typology Part 1, it again is the shooting part of this assignment. This assignment, okay, so our first assignment, you actually had 3 weeks to do it. This one, you've got 2 weeks. So what I want to see next week, what I need you guys to have done next week is the shooting part of it. I'm asking for a Lightroom catalog. I'm not asking for a finished typology, but I want you to find the subject matter that will allow you to create a typology. So if you read through this, I am saying right here, do not do images of food. I get more fucking food. If I don't say this, half of this class will come in with pictures of donuts. I don't want food. So you've got to be more creative than that. The things to consider in actually doing this. So what is due next week is going to be a Lightroom catalog, again, of your top 20 picks for your typology. And again, you're going to submit it via Canvas, just like we did the first assignment. All the information is here all over again, so you can see it. If you want to, again, refresh your memory, either look at the slideshow, Go to the listed artists that are here. There's other examples of other people who are doing the work here. Does this make sense about what to do next week? Are there questions about this? We good? Okay. The next assignment down is to read. This is an important article. This is different than the thing I showed you that was in the resources. This is an actual thing on reframing photography. It's an incredibly famous book. This is a small, brief section on typology. So I need you to read that, and then this assignment right here is to write a brief summary of the article that you just read. Does this all make sense? We good on this? Okay, I need everybody to go into Photoshop really quickly. We need to talk about how you can build in Photoshop a typology. So, everybody's in. I guess I gotta plug my computer in really quickly or it's gonna die.
For the folder that we turn in with our images, just last name underscore first name.
And then 3.1, because that's the number of the assignment.
Underscore 3.1?
Yep. Okay, so first things first, in Photoshop, I need you to go to Preferences. So up to the Photoshop menu, down to Preferences, across to General. And in General, I need you to check this box, Use Legacy New Document Interface. This guy right here. It will make creating a blank Photoshop document much easier than doing the new and improved one that they've got. So with that done, come up to the File menu and come down to New, and the dialog box you just said you wanted will come up. Yep. I will go back. Photoshop, Preferences, General. Under that, and on this left-hand side, there's a Use Legacy New Document Interface. Check that, and then say OK. Then up to the File menu, down to New, and a dialog box will open up. Inside this dialog box, there you have a width, height, resolution, and color mode. You need to change the units on width to inches. So click on the drop-down menu. Mine always says pixels. Click on the drop-down menu. You will get inches. We're going to type in 8 by 10. In the resolution, I want you to change that to 300. In the color mode, we'll leave this as RGB color, 8-bit depth, and then you can leave the background white. That should be what it is by default. However, does anybody see a problem with this new dialog box? Exactly. This is set up, in my case, to give me this in sRGB. I want to actually change it to Adobe RGB, and then say OK. So again, if you've got your screen set up like mine for your retouching space, again, if you double-click on the, the area right next to the word Adobe, it will make your application frame as big as it can be. If you double-click on the hand in the tool dialog box on the left-hand side, it will make this image as big as it can be, but still show you everything. Make sense? And then finally, you need to go to the View menu, and you need to come down and put the check mark right next to Rulers. That will actually give you a ruler on the top and a ruler on the left-hand side. So while we're here at the rulers, because I know some of you guys, certainly the international students, hate the idea that you have to work in inches. You don't have to work in inches if you don't want to. Believe me, I have no idea why this country has still not changed, but the only fucking country in the world now. The only one. Yeah, Donald Trump's going to get right on that. Okay. If you want to change your ruler settings, hover over the ruler itself, hold down your control key. If you have a right-handed mouse, you can do a right click on a mouse. Click on a drop down, and you will also be able to change this to centimeters. If you are people who work in design, people who are actually working in text, you can actually do picas for yours as well if you're a pica person. You can also do percentages. But in my case, I'm going to leave mine as inches right now. Okay, so we need to think about building a typology for this. So the thing that, if you look, we're going to skip ahead just one. I'm going to go back to our, so this is back at our website. I'm going to go to show you the typology part 2, because this is going to be how you put the images that you shoot together. So I'm skipping ahead a week, okay? Just so that you know what it is we're trying to put together here. So to do that, I'm going to simply open this guy up and take a look at it. So what it is saying to do is to actually do the whole thing, consider blah, blah. What is due is you need to print the 6 best images that you shot as a corrected layered Photoshop file. You may do individual prints that you display in a grid form on the wall back here, just like the girl did. Remember the one I showed you where they were actually the individual framed prints? You don't have to frame them, but you do have to, then there'll be 6 separate prints that you actually then hang on the board on the wall for us to critique as a topology, as a single image. Does that make sense? But hopefully, instead of doing that, you will actually build this as one single Photoshop file. Are we good on this? And so I'm going to show you how to do that part. I actually may change this at some point. I won't change it on you guys because it's already written out this way. This is a legacy assignment. But I think I'm going to change this for future classes so that it has to be done in Photoshop. Okay, so here in Photoshop, that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to imagine doing 6 images in this. So I am going to... Okay, you're not going to hear the, or you'll hopefully hear this. Is anybody watching any of these videos? And do you get? Can you still hear when I get all the way over there? Okay, you can kind of hear. It's dim, but you can sort of hear. Barely. Okay, well then hang on, and I'll show you how to get to it. Let me just get rid of this guy, and this guy, and this guy. You're going to lose the screen up here really quick, but I'll come back to it. This is just so that you can hear it. I need everybody to look back here on this board. So, freshy black one. Wow, that sounds really politically incorrect. Okay, so right now I have an 8x10 image, right? So here it is like this. And from here to here is 8 inches. And from here to here is 10 inches. That makes sense, right? That's how we built this whole thing out, right? So I want to do a 6x6 that's perfectly centered in this guy. That's how I'm going to try to build this thing out. Does that sort of make sense? So I am going to say that each one of my images, I'm going to make 2 inches square. So I'm going to do a 2 inch by 2 inch. Well, here, I might as well do it in here, right? 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches. And then I'm going to do the same thing here, right? That's how I want my topology to ultimately look. Does that make sense? Now, you guys can scale this any way you want. You can make larger prints. You can make these images bigger, smaller, whatever. That's pretty much up to you. I'm just giving you an example. I'm not saying you have to do 2-inch square images. Okay? I'm not saying you have to do an 8x10. Does that sort of make sense where we're going here? So again, you're creative, you're artist, use your imagination in this. So, if I'm going across this way, in this direction like this, I'm losing, out of this 8 inches right here, I'm losing 6 inches of that to image, right? So I've got 2 inches, 2 inches, 2 inches. That equals 6 inches. So if I take my 8-inch width and I subtract the 6 inches from it, that leaves me 2 inches of border that I get to deal with, that I get to play with, right? So how many borders do I have, though? I've got 4 of them. I've got 1 here, I've got 2 here, I've got 3 here, and I've got 4 here. Does that make sense? So each one of these, so this is 2 inches like this, and this is 2, and this is 2. Then my space between them, again, I have 2 inches that I have to work with, divided by 4. That ends up being a 1/2 inch here. So this is a 1/2 inch. a half an inch, a half an inch, and a half an inch. Does that make sense? And if I add up all of these, 2, 4, 6, 8, I'm sorry, 7, 8. Does that make sense? So, and that'll be spaced perfectly. We good on that? So now I need to do the same thing going up and down, right? So going up and down, I've got the same, I've got 10 inches now, because that's my height. I've got the same, in this case now, I've only got 2 inches, 4 inches here, because I've only got 2 of them now, right? So I've got 4 inches here that I'm going to subtract from that. That gives me 6 inches of border. Does that make sense? Are we all good? Okay, so I've got 1, 2, 3 borders. What? Exactly. So again, this divided, so this is 2 inches here, 2 inches here, and 2 inches here. So then I go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, makes it up. So this is my plan. Does that make sense to you guys? Everybody good on this one? Okay. So hopefully I'm going to be able to see this from up here. So in Photoshop, we need to lay this thing out here. So you can drag guidelines from your rulers. So if you come up to your top ruler, we're going to do the horizontal ones first. If you come up to your ruler, can you also see you've got your info palette over here? It's 2 places to look at this. Watch my screen when I do this before you guys do it, just so that you see, because there's a couple of readouts that happen. If you click on the ruler and drag down, you pull out a guideline. You will notice that it's actually giving me a readout on it, and my guideline is now saying that I'm down 1.804 inches. As I continue to drop down, I will get to that 2-inch mark eventually. And you will also see that I'm seeing it sort of on my ruler, but I'm also getting the same readout in my info palette. You get it in 3 different places. So I need everybody to drag their ruler out till it drops at 2 inches and let go. That work for everybody? Good? Yes.
How do you change your ruler or your guideline color?
The color, up to the Photoshop menu, down to Preferences, down to Transparency and Gamut. No, I'm sorry, Guides, Grids, and Slices. And then this is where you change the color. This is your guide color right now. This is a smart guide, so it's magenta. Anyway, so everybody's got the line at 2 inches down now, right? Go up to the ruler again, click and drag another one down and bring me one down to 4 inches. And again, if you're like in my case right here, if you're like 4.005, you're within a 5/10,000th of an inch, so don't get too nuts about that.
Is there any way to type it in?
No, there is not.
How did you drag it again? I don't have the like separate tab. Let me do it for that one, but now it's just like pulling.
Pull out the tab.
Oh, good.
Do what?
Okay.
Oh, you've got tab behavior going?
I don't
Yeah.
want
Okay. All right. Okay. The next one, up to the very same thing, the top ruler. Grab and drag one and bring it down to 6 inches. And then the final one all the way down to 8 inches. We all good on that? I'll wait. What keeps happening? Oh, hit the F key. Hit the F key again. One more time. Okay. And that's weird because it's actually showing you actually back behind this image. So you've got negatives in your ruler, and you have no positives in your ruler. Double click on the hand, then double click on the Adobe Photoshop name, double click on the Photoshop again, and double click on the hand again. I have no idea why this is kicking back over like that. Do this finally. Go up to, grab that tab.
This one?
This is untitled, and click and tear it off. And you should be good to go. Yeah. Hit the V key to get the move tool. Let go. Just hit the V key once.
Oh, shoot.
And now just click and drag.
No, I can click and.
Sure, convert to normal layer. I think it says it thinks that. Command Z to undo that. Hit the V key. Go up and grab on the and click and drag. You're good to go. Go all the way down to 4. Okay, next one. On the left, on the ruler that's on the left-hand side, click and drag out, and you will get a readout. I need you to go to a 1/2 inch. That's what we set on our plan up here. So again, it's 0.5. Let go. Click on that same ruler, click and drag out. Now you're going to go out to 2.5. So again, 2.5. Click and drag out again to 3. Click and drag out again to 5. Click and drag out again to 5.5. And then finally click and drag out to 7.5. Boom. That is now our topology that we're going to use. Is everybody good on that part? We good? Okay, I need you to go back into your Lightroom catalog, and I don't care what file you grab, it just, again, it needs to be a raw file, so I'm going to grab the one that I've been working with all along here. So I've got this raw file that I want to bring in, so I'm going to come up to come up to Photo, down to Edit In. Actually, wait, I take that back. Go back to Photoshop first. Let's just break this habit right now. In Photoshop, up to the Photoshop down to Preference menus to Interface, and then to Workspace. And in Workspace, uncheck this Open Document as Tabs and uncheck this Enable Floating Document Window Docking. This will allow you to work with to have your images in your workspace and see them at the same time, not tabbed behavior. So I'm going to say OK to this. Again, then back into Lightroom. I'm going to then click again on the raw file that I want to work with. I am going to come up to Photo, down to Edit In, down to Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. Then when I go to Photoshop, it should be sitting there, and I should have 2 images now that I can see. I've got mine, one's of pictures of Africa, and the other is the grid that I'm actually working on for my topology. Does everybody have that? We good on that? And it's a smart object, I can tell right down here because it's got that little icon. Has everybody got the little icon down there as well? Okay, so we're all good to go on this. To move images from one place to another, from one image to another, you do it via the layers palette. So in my case, with the Africa image showing, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on the layer, and I'm going to drag the layer on top of the grid, the topology grid that I'm actually working on. You have to be able to see these both at the same time. So if one is covering up the other completely, you've got to move these things around so that you can see both of them at the same time. Grab the layer of your image, not the image itself. Don't grab this image and drag it on top. It's the layer of the image. Drag and bring it over. And what I want you to do before you let go, hold down the Shift key. What that does is it brings it in perfectly centered. Now, the image that I'm bringing in is much larger than the one than the topology that I'm working on, but that doesn't matter. It is completely centered. So does everybody have an image that's brought in here and is centered now? Andy, that doesn't look good. What's it saying?
So the target document has a different data than the source document.
Okay, so then your source document again is still, you are trying to bring it in 16-bit. So in your case, you can go ahead and say okay to that. It'll convert it, it'll downsample it. But again, you need to change that in your settings in Lightroom. Okay, so has everybody got an image in there? Are we good? Okay, another advantage to smart objects is that you can transform them non-destructively. This is not true of a baked file, but it is true of a smart object. So to transform this guy, just hit Command T. If you can't remember Command T, it's under the Edit menu. So it'll come up to the Edit menu, down to Transform, and we're just going to do Free Transform. And you will see that you'll get a cross that goes across your image. You will also notice up here at the top that you've got an options menu. This is what you get with the transform dialog box. To see what this means is that you have got, ignore the pixel count that's on the first two numbers. We don't play around with those. But we have a width, that's what this W stands for. Mine says 80%, yours probably says 100%. I've also got a height adjustment that says 80% as well. There's a chain link between these two. If you click on that chain link, what this will allow you to do is change just one of those variables, either the width or the height, and the other will change automatically to keep this thing in its proper ratio. Does that make sense? There's a number of ways you can change this, but the easiest way I think to change it is if you hover your mouse over either the W or the H, you get a hand with a double-headed arrow. That's called the scrubby slider. And if you click and you drag to the right, it will make your image bigger. And if you drag to the left, it will make your image smaller. And I need you to get your image down. I don't want it to fit completely in one of those circles, in one of those squares, but you need to get it down till it's a relatively small scale. Does this make sense what we got going here? Is everybody able to resize their image? Then you'll see that there's a series of possibilities up here. The circle with a slash through it means if you click on that, it will undo everything. It'll take your image back all the way back to its big overscaled size. But instead, what I want you to do is simply click on the check mark. This image has now been scaled down. To show you that this is indeed a smart object, hit Command T again, and what you'll notice is that in my case, I reduced this down to 16%. Those values are still in here. I could go right back up to 100% or 80% if I wanted to, and it would be fine. Again, non-destructive. You can scale up and down and up and down and up and down. It does not matter. You will never degrade the image, no matter how many times you do it. Are we good on this? Okay. Time to finally finish this guy out. So I'm going to do this I'm going to use this to actually do, I'm going to do it for the first top left quadrant that I've got going right here for my image. So I'm going to hit the V key or pick the very top tool right here, which is the move tool. And I'm going to click and I'm going to drag this guy up so that it hovers in that sort of area underneath where I want my first topology to be. Does that make sense? Everybody good on this? I'm going to actually zoom into this area a little bit now just to make it a little easier for me to see. The shortcut for the zoom tool is holding down the space bar and the command key. The command key is just to the left of the space bar. That will give you the positive zoom tool. If you add the option key to that, that's the negative zoom tool. But I'm going to use the positive zoom tool. And I'm just going to click in a little bit so that I can see this guy. Are we good on this? Finally, I'm going to grab the marquee tool. It's the tool that's right under the move tool. It's the M key is the shortcut for it, but it's the rectangular marquee tool. I'm going to grab this guy, and then I'm going to come over, and now on my guidelines, I'm going to come to the top left corner of where the guidelines met, and I'm going to click and drag out so that it snaps to the guidelines. This is the window that I want for my image. Does that make sense? Can you see my screen? Okay, so all I've done is use the marquee tool to make the selection that is those guidelines. Are we good on this? Okay. And then finally, I'm going to come down to the bottom of my layers palette. I have this smart object. My Africa picture right here is selected. That layer is active. You can tell because it's a little bit lighter gray. It's highlighted. If you click then on the square at the bottom, the square that's actually got the circle in it, that is the add layer mask. And what you will see now is you have actually masked this image out. So, did this work for everybody? Okay, here, this is the best part. This is the best part. You'll see that you've actually got now on this layer, you've got the image and you've also got the layer mask, right? That's what's controlling what you can see. You've also got a chain link that's right between these two. These two are connected to one another. However, if you hit the V key to get the move tool and you click and you drag, you see that it moves both things. It moves your image, but it moves the mask as well. If we wanted to relocate this, that would actually be great because we could actually take it to a different place. I don't want to relocate mine, so I want to go back to where I was. Command Z will take me back to where I was before the move. However, if you unclick the chain link between the image and the mask, you can now move either one. Now, in my case, the mask is selected. You know it's selected because it's got these little bracket keys around it. But if you pick the image, you can now, again, hit the V key or click on the move tool at the top. You can now move your image around inside that mask to change what it is you see. Does this make sense? Is this working for you guys? There's another trick to this. You can transform here. If we had the chain link locked between the two of these, I just relocked it. If I did a transform now, it would transform my image, but it would also transform my mask. You'll see right here. I'm going to do a Command T to transform. I'll click on the link between width and height, and I'll make my image bigger. And you can see it makes everything bigger. It makes the image bigger, but it also makes the mask bigger. So I'm going to click on the circle through the slash through the circle and say, I do not want to do that. I'm going to uncheck the chain link between the two. I'm going to select just the image. I can tell because I've got the brackets around it. But now when I go Command T, click on the chain link between width and height, and again, use the scrubby slider. Now I can make my image larger or smaller. I can still move it around. So this is how you would actually be able to scale your typologies, move them around, get them centered, the whole 9 yards. Does this sort of make sense? Are there questions about this? And then, guys, you just repeat the process really quickly because we've got 2 minutes to do it. Go right back into Lightroom. Grab a completely different image. I'm going to grab one of some other tree. I'm going to go up to the photo menu, down to Edit In, down to Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. It comes in as a smart object in Photoshop. I'm going to grab the layer of my image, drag it on top of my topology layout, hold down the Shift key and let go. It comes in huge. Again, it's this layer right now. I'm going to hit Command T to transform it. I'm going to click on the link between width and height. I'm going to crank it way down till it's a small image. If you want to move around in your image without moving elements in your image, you hold down the space bar alone and you'll get the hand and you can actually scroll it. So I'm just changing mine so that I can see where I want to mask this guy. I'm going to then grab this image and take it up so that it's roughly in the next square that I'm going to use. I'm going to, again, hit the check mark to go ahead and to have that typology done on there. If you can't see the guides because your image is hiding it, turn the eyeball off. Then you can see them. Grab the marquee tool, click and drag out across your guidelines to do the next window over that you want to do. Turn the eyeball back on now. Make sure that that layer is selected. Click on Add Layer Mask, and you've got your next window. Again, break the link between the chain, between the mask and the image. Right now, the mask is what is highlighted. It's got the brackets around it. You need to select the image. And again, Command T to transform it because I want mine a little bit smaller. I'm going to click on the chain link between width and height. I'm going to make mine as small as I can get it, but still fill my frame. It's about like that. I'm going to go more for the bottom of the trunk of the tree. and click on the check mark, and I've got my second one in. If you double click on the hand, it'll jump back out, and you are well on your way to making a topology. Are there questions about this? Are we good? I'll see you guys next week. Oh, homework. Did everybody drop homework? I'll show you really quickly what it should look. So if you don't see your name up here, you didn't get your homework dropped in the Dropbox. So this is what I've got, is this right up here. This is everybody that I've got. So if you're still dropping, you need to let me know, because otherwise I'm going to turn this off. Oh, wait. Last thing to tell you really quickly. So the recordings, to get to the recordings, simply go to into any browser. I'm just going to hit Command N to get to a new one. Go to YouTube. In YouTube, do a search for Verser. V-E-R-S-E-R. And say OK. It should take you to my YouTube channel. And once in my YouTube channel, although it's as weird that I'm at, you should be able to get to my YouTube channel, although it's weird because it's not happening with me. Click on my name to get to there. In the YouTube channel, click on videos, and there will be a complete list of all the videos. There's a lot of video content, though, because I record all of my classes. So what you guys are looking for instance, last week is this photo practice 3 session number 3, part 1. Again, I'd stop the recordings and start a new one between the breaks. So for tonight, there will be, I think, only one part because we were doing critique before and I don't record that. Does this make sense? So this is how you find them.
Thank you.
See you next week.